There are a couple of different approaches to practice that you'll find in contemporary Buddhism. One has to do with an acceptance of life, acceptance of all of life's difficulties and its good parts too. And another has to do with a practice towards escape, at least framed as a kind of escape from certain dangers in life. And these two approaches to practice may seem in conflict, and we may be confused about how to reconcile them. And so that's what I'll be discussing on today's video, coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. Also, check out onlinedharma.org for courses if you want to take a deeper dive into the Dharma, including a new course that I have out on the Buddha's teaching to lay people. If you've been to a Buddhist center or heard Buddhist talks or perhaps read articles that are around Buddhism and Buddhist ideas, you will have probably heard this notion of acceptance, or of what Tara Brach, who is probably the leading teacher of this kind of approach, calls radical acceptance. This ability or wish or practice of accepting all that our life brings us, at least in some respect, that we come at life with that framework, where our approach is one of understanding that life has its difficulties, but that in some sense we have to radically accept it. We have to be willing to radically accept it, at least in certain parts of our practice. And Tara Brach, in fact, quotes D.H. Lawrence, who talks in a similar kind of vein, who says, we must plant ourselves again in the universe. Meaning that, to some extent, in ordinary life, we tend to be escapist in certain ways. We tend to sort of leave the real world behind in various ways, and that gets us into difficulties, into problems. We're not confronting the realities of life. And so we need to replant ourselves in the universe in this kind of radically accepting way in order to really make peace with it all. Now, those of us who are familiar with some of the early teachings in Buddhism may at times be quite confused, or radically confused, shall we say, by this approach. Because within early Buddhism, in the teachings of early Buddhism, we find quite a different frame for our practice. In particular, the practice is usually framed as one of escape. That is to say, the Buddha talks about the aim of practice, in a sense, of escaping, as he says, birth and death. And within a traditional context, what that meant was eventually escaping samsara, because in a traditional belief, traditional beliefs in Buddhism are that we are reborn, we have been reborn a countless number of times, that this kind of cycle of birth and rebirth over the eons is basically the problem with which we're confronted. And that therefore practice is seen, again within that context, as an escape from that kind of problem. Nowadays, for those of us who are of a more secular bent, who set aside questions about rebirth, may similarly talk about or consider the point of practice as one of escaping birth and death understood in a certain sense. That is to say, let's say, escaping our faulty or delusional notions of our permanent self or of permanence within objects around us. We're sort of escaping from that idea. Now, also within the early texts is a framing of practice around the concepts of what's called gratification, danger, and escape. And in these, the Buddha gave many suttas, many discussions where he talks about gratification, danger, and escape. And in this context, what he's talking about is gratification, that we find pleasure in the world, that gratifies, that gives us a certain kind of, it makes us want to stay, if you like. And I think we can all appreciate that. I'm sure you can in your life, as can I. You get up in a beautiful morning, at the moment the autumn leaves are out here, And it's gorgeous, and that is the gratification of life. That or the beautiful smells of beautiful flowers in the springtime, or a great meal, anything that we would find sense pleasure in, or pleasures in life, are the gratifications of life. However, the Buddhist teaching goes farther, goes deeper if you like, and then asks what the dangers are. That is to say, it's not just that there are gratifications, but that those gratifications come with dangers. And in particular, the dangers that they come with are the dangers of attachment. And I think you will, as well as I, can understand how we become attached to these gratifying parts of our lives. When the beautiful flowers cease to arise in spring, or at the end of fall, let's say, where we are now, we can feel a certain sadness, a certain poignancy about that. And while that's a small issue, we can feel much larger and deeper problems when we have to give up larger and more important parts of our lives simply because of the vicissitudes of life. And some of those come because we may have to move somewhere, we may have to change jobs, we may go through a divorce and have to change partners, or give up a partner. We may lose family members or friends to disease or death. Or at the end of life, we may have to give up our jobs and have to go into, let's say, an assisted living kind of situation. All of these present dangers, and part of the dangers of the gratifications is that we cling to them and don't want to give them up. And so that is a major part of the early Buddhist teaching. And the third part of that, of course, is escape, that there's a way of escaping from the predicament. And we escape from the predicament through Buddhist practice. That is to say, the Buddhist practice is framed as a practice of escape from a certain kind of danger, rather than being framed as a practice of acceptance. And these seem to be really opposite practices, or at least opposite framings. Now, before I talk about the history of all of this and some potential solutions, some potential ways of bringing this all together, I did want to spend a couple of minutes and talk about Patreon. And I'd love to tell you about the importance of Patreon for this channel. First of all, I want to say it's a great way for you to find out what's going on behind the scenes. I'll put posts every once in a while about behind-the-scenes issues or problems that are coming up, or concerns that you may have, or I may have, or questions that we may have for each other. Also, it's a great way for you to get an audio version of these talks in case you want to listen to them in the way you would listen to a podcast. There's even an RSS feed for you to download these the way you would download a video. If you want to involve yourself more, we have a ways of putting your name down in the description box below each of these videos. And it's a way for me to keep these ad-free. Because as you know, many of these YouTube videos are supported through ads. And I've been trying to keep these ad-free, and this is one way we can do this. So, to move on now to the history of this distinction between a framing of practice as an escape from danger, and this more contemporary framing of practice as radical acceptance. It's hard to say exactly where that began, because these are fuzzy kinds of topics. They're vague. They're difficult, I think, to pin down historically. But I think in a broad way of looking at it, we can see the origins of this more accepting kind of approach with the rising of the Mahayana, which would have been in the early centuries of the Common Era, or perhaps a little bit in the very early centuries before the Common Era, where we have a rising of, on one part, what's called the notion of Buddha nature, or Tathagatagarbha. This notion that within ourselves we contain a kind of an essence, a pure essence of pure awareness that is infused with, as Tara Brach talks about it, infused with kindness and compassion. This kind of underlying essence to ourselves, this Buddha nature, this way that we are all Buddhas in our deepest essence, is one thing that we can touch on. Another thing I think that is an origin for this more accepting kind of view is the bodhisattva path itself, where The Bodhisattva path is a notion that on this path, we aren't simply pursuing the path in order for ourselves to become awakened and then do this escape from birth and death, but rather we set aside our own awakening. If we understand this in a traditional sense, where traditionally when we become awakened we're no longer reborn, in this new interpretation, we put aside this end of rebirths, this escape from birth and death in the literal sense, in order to be reborn as a bodhisattva, in order to help others. So we're setting aside our own awakening, if you like, for the sake of other beings, for the sake of helping others, out of compassion. And that turn, that kind of a turn in the way that we see the path, is a turn towards, if you like, or a framing in terms of radical acceptance, or acceptance of the way things are, because we're putting ourselves back in it. In a sense, we're sort of making our peace with the world enough to remain in it to help others. Now, in Tara Brach's own work, I think we find a skillful use of the idea, the concept of Buddha nature, of this idea that in our essence we are Buddhas, that in our essence we are this kind of pure awareness that is infused with kindness and compassion. And the reason she, I think, frames things in this way is because for her, and for indeed many of us, it seems that one of the great grave problems in the contemporary world, in the West at least, is one of self-hatred, is that so many of us have a very low sense of ourselves, even a kind of a contempt for ourselves, a sort of a contemptuous idea of our own worth in the world. And coming from this point of view, having in the back this notion of Buddha nature can be, and we'll get to this in a moment, a very good practice. Now, where does this idea of self-hatred come from? It's hard to say. Tara Brach cites the Dalai Lama as having been completely confused by the idea of self-hatred, that from within his cultural context, such a thing really didn't exist. And indeed, it seems that in the Buddha's own day, it was relatively rare, if it existed at all. But I think we can perhaps point to at least some of the origin of self-hatred in a kind of the radical notion of individuality that we find nowadays. This notion that we are completely responsible for everything we do, that nobody is responsible but us for what we do in our own lives. And while this can lead to an overinflated sense of ego in the positive sense, it can just as easily lead to an underinflated ego, or a real sense of, again, self-hatred or self-contempt if we make mistakes, as all of us do. And if we make mistakes, perhaps large mistakes in our own lives, we do things that really redound to our own ill, or at least in our perception redound to our own ill, or the ill of those around us, we may hold ourselves in such disregard and such contempt for having done these things, because we feel ourselves completely responsible, that we feel that we're sort of worthless. Or perhaps we're treated as worthless by people around us. And Tara Brach in this book, which I'll cite in the show notes below in case you're interested, called Radical Acceptance, in this book cites a story of a young girl who is at a restaurant with her family, and the waitress comes by to ask what she wants, and she tells the waitress what she wants for dinner. And after she's done that, her father speaks up and basically says, no, she's not going to have any of that. She's going to have this, this, and this. She's going to have something completely different. And the waitress goes around and repeats what their orders are, and tells the girl that she's going to get the girl what the girl wants rather than what the father wants. And then the waitress goes away, and the little girl is very moved and perhaps in tears, saying that somebody finally thought of her as a real person. Because clearly within that particular family context, she wasn't treated as a real person with her own ideals and her own desires. Now, we can make of that story what we will, but the point is clear that a lot of this comes from our own upbringing in some sense. And that can be very difficult to get around. But in any event, from this kind of a situation where we're in this kind of feeling of contempt for ourselves, dislike or hatred for ourselves, if we're given a practice, a frame of escape, we may indeed naturally take that as a practice of escape from that which we find difficult, that which we have aversion to, an escape from ourselves, an escape from ourselves into a kind of an illusion or a delusory kind of lifestyle where we're pretending that we don't exist, where we're living off at some remove from ourselves, which is not a healthy way of proceeding. Because whereas in early Buddhism the danger was sense pleasures, and that was the danger was getting too involved in sense pleasures, we can, if we misunderstand that kind of practice, we can take the danger as one of ourselves, those things that we find dangerous in our own lives, and that of course can be a problem. Now, within the context of early Buddhism, the Buddha saw two major problems with the way that we confront ourselves in particular. One of these is the standard one, which is most of us, or many of us, and certainly in the Buddha's day, and the Dalai Lama as well sees it this way, that we hold ourselves in too high of a regard. We love ourselves too much and think too highly of ourselves, and that can lead to what the Buddha terms eternalism. This notion that since we are so great, we cling to ourselves, and we cling to ourselves as somehow everlasting, never dying, perfect entities that never change. And as a result, we kind of reify ourselves, and then we're continually disappointed in various ways when we end up changing. And so that's the primary danger for the Buddha, but there is a secondary danger, which is one that the Buddha termed nihilism. And this is indeed, I think, the problem that can stem from the contemporary disregard or contempt for ourselves. In the sense, if we hold ourselves too little, if we're too aversive to ourselves, we can end up with a conception of ourselves in which we don't exist, that we think we're literally nothing, that we're beneath contempt in that sense. And that we sort of, as a result, end up what's called spiritually bypassing. I did a video on spiritual bypassing in case you're interested in that concept. I'll put a link to it here. Spiritually bypassing so much work that we need to do with ourselves. That is, we set it to one side. We're so aversive to it that we pretend it doesn't exist. And that, I think, can be a grave danger in today's society, is spiritually bypassing so many psychological problems with ourselves through this kind of self-hatred. So what is a skillful remedy for nihilism in the Buddha's sense? Well, one skillful remedy is basically to practice in a way that helps build up a sense of self. Just as for an eternalist, we want to deflate the notion of self, for a nihilist, for somebody who has a contempt for themselves, they need to have a skillful sense of self built up from the ground up. And that is where this conception of Buddha nature comes in. This conception that in some sense our essence is a pure awareness that is suffused with kindness and compassion, which are the paradigmatic, skillful, healthy kinds of emotions. And if we think of that as sort of lying underneath all of this problematic stuff and try to get at it in that, if that's our frame, that can help build up a sense of self and where we can work with it in a more skillful way. Now, historically, if we look back to early Buddhism, we won't find a notion of Buddha nature. Instead, we'll find the notion that, if you look at our history, traditionally, again, a history of a countless number of lifetimes, we're not going to find a sort of an origin of a pure and unadulterated kindness and compassion. Instead, we're going to find a history of delusion, of ignorance, of hatred and greed. We're not going to find that in our own past. We're not going to find even an essence right now. For the Buddha, the notion of non-self is a notion of non-essence, which doesn't mean that there's no self at all. It means that the self that there is is something that's always changing, and so not really definable in a strict sense. It's something that's always undergoing change. It's something that's always having its ups and downs. So this notion of Buddha nature is not, it does not stem from early Buddhism. It's a later kind of construct, but that does not mean that it's necessarily bad practice. In certain cases, it can be skillful, as we've just seen, to practice with it in order to build up a sort of a skillful sense of self that we can work with more easily than we can with our own self-hatred. Another aspect of this kind of acceptance, or radical acceptance, is that we can find an aspect of that even in the earliest practice of mindfulness meditation, where it's said in the preamble, which just talks, the preamble to the sutta on mindfulness, it talks about leaving aside desire and aversion for the world. That is to say, in order to get in a proper kind of mindful state, we have to stop, at least we have to practice kind of letting go of our normal tendency to grasp at certain parts of reality, of our experience, or to be aversive to other parts. And in that practice, we are basically coming to a place of something like, or at least a step towards equanimity, a step towards this kind of acceptance of the way things are, of simply sitting with whatever arises. And this then puts us in a place where we can be aware of this material, this stuff as it arises. We have to be open to it. We have to be psychologically accepting in the sense of radical acceptance, perhaps in Tara Brach's sense. We have to be open in order to see this material as it comes up in our minds. And then, once we see it, and this is also something that Tara Brach says that's very, very important, it's not that we then accept whatever it comes up willy-nilly and simply say, okay, that's the way things are. That would not be skillful at all. But having this initial acceptance, this initial radical acceptance, then allows us to sit back with it and become aware over time of what is skillful and unskillful in what has arisen in our minds. So we have the moment of radical acceptance, the time of doing that during meditation. Then we have a kind of a wise view upon what has arisen so that we can then deal with it. And what we will see more often than not, for all of us beginners along this path, is a lot of bad habits, a lot of things that arise that give us problems, things that when things occur in the world we don't react in the most skillful way. We'll see that, or that we're doing things that are not to our own benefit. We'll see that. And so this is a route, this radical acceptance, this practice is a route towards seeing what's skillful and unskillful in our lives, what's healthy and unhealthy, and then working on that. And so the next step here is to see these bad habits of ours and work with them. And I have a video about bad habits, which I think would be very useful for you all to look at this point if you're interested in continuing further along this kind of thought process. And I do hope that these are useful to you. I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos, and meanwhile, all of you be well.